Starting off this countdown, we have the Vipholm experiments. This was a series of experiments in Sweden from 1945 to 1955. It's literally going to make you sick to your stomach when you find out what they did. Basically, they force-fed people with mental illness sweets to see if sugar was related to tooth decay. Imagine people just cramming food down your throat against your will. It's very gross. These experiments were conducted by the government and sponsored by the sugar industry. The experiments lasted for about 2 years, and by then, the teeth of about 50 of the subjects in the experiment had been completely ruined. In our 9th spot, we had the UK Special Demonstration Squad. This is the name of a group of undercover police officers in the UK. Now, the things that they did are going to shock you. For example, they would steal birth certificates and identities of people that had died at a young age. They'd make sure that they would be around their age and then use their identities. The younger the person died, the better, because that means they didn't already live a life that they would have to cover up. And then they would go around with this new identity. Some cases they actually got into relationships with women, but the whole time they did so just to spy on them. In November of 2015, the Metropolitan Police Force apologized to 7 women tricked into relationships by these officers. Like, imagine that, dating someone you're madly in love with, sometimes even having a kid with them, only for them to be like, oh, sorry, gotta go, was only dating you to get intel on you and your friend circle. It's disgusting, and it's actually happened to multiple women. In our 8th spot, we have the radioactive waste. Apparently, there's a huge radioactive dumping zone located in Tonawanda, New York. In fact, they dumped more than 37 million gallons of radioactive waste from their World War II atomic bomb tests. This area has a high rate of cancer and thyroid conditions, and this is the reason why, and no one's talking about it. In our 7th spot, we have the hepatitis tests. In 1956, the US government began running tests on young individuals living at the Willowbrook State School in Staten Island. This was a state-supported institution for children with intellectual disabilities. And what they did to these students was give them hepatitis in order to track the development of the viral infection. Of course, they were being experimented on without knowledge or consent. To make matters worse, the study lasted 14 years. They also injected them with a number of drugs to see what they would do to their body and the hepatitis. Imagine intentionally making a group of people sick for an experiment. The grossest part is that when the government was exposed for this project, they tried to justify their actions by saying that these people were probably gonna wind up contracting it anyways. In our 6th spot today, we have Operation Popeye. This is another very wild one. Operation Popeye was a highly classified weather modification program during the Vietnam War from 1967 to 1972. You heard me correctly. The government learned how to control the weather. Basically, they wanted to increase rainfall in certain areas to prevent enemies and military supply trucks from being able to travel. In fact, they caused a number of landslides and flooding in that area. Weather manipulation has since been banned from use for military gain. We are now at our 5th and halfway mark with HIV. In the 1980s, the HIV epidemic broke out. No one knew how it spread, they just knew that it should be feared, and tons of LGBTQ+ community members were sadly contracting the virus. Well, rumor has it that HIV was a government experiment that was meant to wipe out the undesirables. Of course, the US government has denied this claim, and it's just a conspiracy, we don't know for sure. But based on the other experiments done on minority groups, it's hard to know what to believe. In our 4th spot today, we have Project 112 and Project SHAD, or SHAD. Project 112 and Project SHAD took place from 1962 to 1973 and involved a number of veterans or military personnel. Basically, both tests involved exposing these people to substances they might want to use in warfare. Nearly 6,000 people were exposed to Coxiella burnetii, which is Q fever, Staphylococcal enterotoxin B, which causes food poisoning, and sarin and soman gas. Sarin is a very, very dangerous nerve gas, and soman can cause death in minutes. Both can be fatal if only the tiniest amount gets on the skin. These men had no clue that they were being exposed to this. Moving on to number 3, we have Project Sunshine. This is another very messed up government project. During the 1950s, the US government was using stillborns to conduct radiation tests on. They wanted to determine the effects that radiation would have on humans and how much we could withstand in case of a nuclear fallout. They called this Project Sunshine, and it was anything but rainbows and sunshine. What's sad is that the government was stealing body parts and tissues from morgues without families' consent. It said that more than 1,500 samples were gathered worldwide. This is incredibly sad and sick. Coming in at number 2, we have the syphilis experiments. In 1932, the US Public Health Service created an experiment to see the health effects of untreated syphilis. But the test subjects were told that they were receiving free treatment to cure their syphilis. And that was a lie. Instead of giving the men the recommended penicillin treatment, they gave them placebos, like aspirin. Sadly, 28 men died of syphilis because of these experiments, 100 more passed away from syphilis-related complications, and 40 spouses contracted this disease. And 19 women who gave birth passed on syphilis to their newborn children. In 1997, Bill Clinton apologized to the survivors and their families on behalf of the government. And he admitted that the tests were, and I quote, profoundly and morally wrong. And in our number 1 spot today, we have the radiation tests. In 1953, a number of tests were done on pregnant women to see the effects that radioactive iodine would have on them and their newborns. These studies were terrible. In one study, researchers gave these women doses of iodine 131. Sadly, they all miscarried. When they did, they continued to study the women's aborted embryos. Another study took place after World War II. 829 pregnant mothers in Tennessee were given vitamin drinks. They were informed that these drinks would improve their health and their babies. But it actually contained radioactive iron, and the researchers wanted to see how fast the radioisotopes crossed into the placenta. Several of the young passed away from these experiments. 4 died from cancers as a result of the experiments, and the women experienced rashes, bruises, anemia, hair and tooth loss, and cancer as well. Meanwhile, they just wanted the best for their babies and thought that this drink was going to help them, not kill them. Starting off this countdown, we have the transmission tests. The US government once ran a series of tests on people with disabilities and prison inmates. They thought that it was fine to do so with this demographic of people because basically they thought they were going nowhere in life and they have nothing to lose. One of the tests in the mid-1940s was quite disgusting. It involved having young men swallow unfiltered stool. They did this to see how a deadly stomach bug was transmitted. The study took place at a reformatory prison, the New York State Vocational Institution. They claimed that they couldn't just spray the germs and have the test subjects breathe it in. No. They said that swallowing it was a more effective way to spread the disease. Of course, these men were forced to do so against their will and were left traumatized. In our 9th spot, we have the malaria tests. In the late 1940s, a group of men were infected with malaria before being starved for 5 days. While being starved, some of them were subjected to hard labor. Those men lost 14 pounds within a few days. They then were treated for their malaria with a number of drugs. What's wild is that this study was always kept a secret. In fact, most studies from the 1940s to 60s were never covered by the media. And if they were, the focus was, oh my God, the government might find a cure. It's amazing the work that they're doing. The focus was never on how they were finding the cure and their poor test subject. In our 8th spot today, we have the pregnant women. In the late 1940s, a number of researchers were testing diethylstilbestrol, which is a synthetic estrogen, on pregnant women. They thought that this would help women against pregnancy complications, but it sadly did the exact opposite. A number of women ended up miscarrying or giving birth to low birth weight babies. None of the women knew that they were being experimented on in the first place. If they had known, they probably wouldn't have risked it. In our 7th spot, we have the syphilis experiment. In the early 1950s, the government controlled a syphilis study on men in Guatemala. Their aim was to find out how syphilis and other diseases spread. Sadly, not much is known about these experiments because the government records were destroyed years after the program was shut down in 1956. What we do know though is that the men were exposed to prostitutes infected with this disease, but they later found that that didn't spread the infections quick enough, so they decided to inject the disease into the men. They did so by two ways. One, by making a medicine with this disease and putting it on their downstairs eggplant, or by injecting it directly into their spine. What made this worse is that there were no age restrictions to these tests, so they were targeting the young too. Some declined drastically in health. Plus, a number of test subjects were left untreated so that they could study the progression of the infections as well as the damage it would cause. In our sixth spot, we have the Manhattan Project. The Manhattan Project is the project that produced the world's first atomic bomb. They conducted a number of tests, including detonating a series of bombs in a New Mexico desert. They also conducted a number of tests on humans to see the effects that radiation would have on us. One of the tests included monitoring nuclear technicians for the effects of radiation exposure. The technicians had no clue that they were being studied. Some fell extremely sick. One woman even suffered from kidney failure. That's when the workers began to wonder if they were getting sick from the radiation. Later, more tests were done on humans. This time, they were injected with polonium and other radioactive elements. In the end, hundreds of people ended up being injected or fed with plutonium, which is one of the most dangerous substances in the world. Sadly, they targeted individuals with disabilities. Over 57 children with disabilities and more than 100 adults with disabilities were injected with plutonium against their will. We're now at our fifth and halfway mark with the drug tests. Over the years, the government has sponsored a number of drug tests to see the effects that they have on humans. One involved a professional tennis player, Harold Blower. In 1952, he died after being injected with a fatal dose of a hallucinogenic drug. The U.S. Department of Defense, the Department of Justice, and the New York State Attorney General all worked together to conceal evidence of its involvement in this experiment. They did so for 23 years. They all denied having any part of this. They were like, oh, the army was injecting him with drugs? We had nothing to do with that. We didn't know. Yeah, right. In our fourth spot, we have LSD. Dr. Frank Olson was an American bacteriologist and biological warfare scientist that worked for the Army and CIA. On November 28, 1953, Frank died after falling out of a hotel in Pennsylvania. His death is quite controversial because we don't know what truly happened, but there are a lot of theories out there. So apparently on November 19th, Olson was given LSD without his knowledge or consent. Then, just days later, he plummeted to his death. Many believe that the government had something to do with this. Either they were drugging him constantly and he became so delusional that he took his own life, or he was in too deep. Apparently, days before his death, he attempted to resign. He even told his wife that he made a terrible mistake, and then he mysteriously died. Suspicious, don't you think? In our third spot, we have mental health experiments. Dr. Robert Heath is quite the controversial figure in history, and that's due to the number of tests that he did on patients with schizophrenia. In the studies funded by the US Army, he would dose the patients with LSD before implanting electrodes into their brain and shocking them. He thought that this would cure all their problems. He also would use this on gay men to try and make them straight. In our second spot, we have the monster experiment. In 1939, psychologist Wendell Johnson and his student Mary Tudor conducted something known as the monster experiment. For this, they used 22 young orphans. Now, the study was all about stuttering. They wanted to see if psychological abuse could induce stuttering in children. And turns out, it did. So for this test, they divided the orphans into two groups. One group, the children were praised and treated humanely. In the other group, they were treated the complete opposite. In the end, the children in the negative group developed stutters that they retained for the rest of their lives. And in our number one spot today, we have the mustard gas experiments. In the early part of World War II, it was feared that Germany was going to turn to chemical warfare. So the US Army wanted to be prepared. One way that they prepared was by studying the effects of mustard gas. So they gathered a number of healthy young men who volunteered. However, had they known what they were going to go through, chances are they wouldn't have volunteered. 1,200 volunteers were tested in small teams for several weeks. They were ordered to strip to the waist and then were sent into a chamber and doused with mustard gas. According to one survivor, and I quote, "All of the men began writhing around and screaming in pain as the chemical burned through their skin. Some pounded on the walls and demanded to be let out, though the doors were locked and only opened when the time was up." Now, mustard gas causes nasty, nasty burns to the skin, and it can also cause uncontrollable bleeding in the lungs if it's inhaled. Now, the men did receive treatment after the experiment, but they were threatened. They said that if they told anyone about these experiments, then they were going to be sent to military prison. Starting off this countdown, we have the Iran-Contra affair. In the 1980s, the US government made a secret deal to trade missiles and other arms to free some Americans held hostage by terrorists in Lebanon. But then they used the funds from the arms deal to support the Contras, a rebel group attempting to overthrow the government in that country. These transactions were a violation of the law. Congress passed legislation barring US aid to the Contras, and they don't negotiate with hostage takers or pay ransoms. So this caused a huge political scandal that almost brought down Ronald Reagan. In our 9th spot, we have Project Mannequin. What's scary is that the US government might still be working on this project had it not been for several whistleblowers exposing them. Basically, they were working on this project known as Project Mannequin, which was basically them trying to produce super soldiers. They were going to kidnap people at a young age and then groom them to become cold-blooded killers. They also were going to take kids being given up for adoption and do the same to them. They would then use mind control and other techniques to create these soldiers. But Max Spears blew the whistle on this project, only later to die under mysterious circumstances. And then, when investigators came to his house, they wiped his computer and SIM card clean. That is incredibly suspicious. What do they not want us to know? Moving on to number 8, we have Operation Sleeping Beauty. Operation Sleeping Beauty was a psychological warfare program in which the government was going to use high-power electromagnetic pulses to disturb soldiers on the battlefields. You know how sometimes high frequencies or sounds drive us insane? Well, they were going to use that to manipulate enemy soldiers so that they would surrender. Rumor has it that the government was using real human test subjects for this project. Of course, against their will. Although the government claims this project is over, some believe it's still in the works, just under a new name. In our 7th spot, we have Robert P. Hansen. Robert Hansen was an FBI double agent. While working for the FBI, he was simultaneously working for Soviet and Russian intelligences. So he was feeding them top secret information. In fact, he sold thousands of classified documents to the Soviet and Russian intelligences. These documents outlined US strategies with regards to nuclear wars and exposed developments in the military's weapons and detailed aspects of the US counterintelligence program. His espionage was considered as possibly the worst intelligence disaster in US history. In our 6th spot, we have Project QK Hilltop. This is a very, very controversial and unethical project by the CIA. Basically, around this time, the Chinese were using brainwashing techniques, so the CIA was like, maybe we should try this too. Not only did they brainwash their victims, they also tortured and deprived them of sleep. The head of the experiment was Dr. Harold Wolf, and he knew that testing on human subjects was unethical, but that still didn't stop him or the government from conducting these tests. We are now at our 5th and halfway mark with Operation Midnight Climax. I just want to know who named this one. Oh my. Anyways, this project began in the 1950s and it involved a CIA-run brothel with real workers. They got the workers to lure men there and then drug them with LSD and record what happened. It was the government's way of getting top secret information or to get blackmail material on people. And of course, this project was controversial for a number of reasons. Eventually, it was shut down in the 1960s. In our 4th spot, we have the Watergate scandal. This is one scandal that is still discussed to this day. It's for sure gonna go down in history. So on June 17th, 1972, 5 men working for the committee to re-elect the president broke into the Democratic Party's headquarters in the Watergate. a hotel office building in Washington. But they got caught going through the files and trying to plant listening devices there. 5 days later, President Nixon was like, "No, I had nothing to know about this. Wow, shocker." He denied his involvement. But we all know that this was his plan to ensure his re-election in 1972. The scandal gets messier though, and he faced the possibility of impeachment. In fact, Nixon became the first president to resign from office in August of 1974. In our third spot, we have Project Grudge. For quite some time now, the US government has been secretly monitoring UFOs. In fact, they even have tried to make their own craft, but that's a completely different project altogether, and we'll address that another time. Project Grudge was all about finding out about UFO sightings and then debunking these sightings. However, not all the sightings could be debunked, leading many to believe that they could have been real UFO spacecrafts. This project is still ongoing, just possibly under a different name. In 2017, there were tons of UFO sightings reported that they were investigating. In our second spot today, we have Bigfoot. Imagine the FBI spending thousands of dollars tracking a legendary monster. How would that make you feel? They could be out solving real-life crime or murder cases, but no, they're trying to see if the Bigfoot is really real. And that's why this next project was so controversial. The FBI was keeping tabs on and tracking the Bigfoot. In the FBI's Freedom of Information Library, you can find the FBI's file on Bigfoot. These files are only released when the subject is deceased. So they believe that not only was the Bigfoot a real beast, but they believe that it is now dead. But what about its relatives though? Like, there has to be more than one Bigfoot out there. And in our number one spot today, we have the hepatitis experiments. In 1956, the US government began running tests on young individuals housed at the Willowbrook State School in Staten Island. The test involved intentionally giving hepatitis to these residents in order to track the development of this viral infection. Of course, they were being experimented on without their knowledge or consent. To make matters worse, the study lasted 14 years. And they also injected a number of these test subjects with other viruses to see its protection against hepatitis. When the government was exposed, they tried to justify their actions, saying that these people were probably going to wind up contracting it anyways.